The U-boat designated as U-31 emerged on December 28, 1936, at the A.G. Weser shipyard in Bremen, on Germany's Baltic northern coast. It was one of the first 10 German Type 7 submarines to be built, later designated as Type VIIA submarines. U-31 had a total length of 211 feet 8 inches or 64.51 meters and a height of 31 feet 2 inches or 9.5 meters. She could displace 626 tons at surface and 745 tons below surface. U-31 was powered when at surface by two MAN-M6V 4046 4-stroke, 6-cylinder diesel engines and two BVCGG-UB 728 double-acting electric motors when submerged. She could operate at depths of up to 750 feet or 230 meters. Those engines afforded her a maximum surface speed of 17 knots, equating to 20 miles or 31 kilometers per hour, and maximum submerged speed of 8 knots, or 9.2 miles or 15 kilometers per hour. These submarines had decent munitions on board, including 5 21-inch torpedo tubes, with 4 at the bow and 1 at the stern, 11 torpedoes, 46-inch SKC-35 naval gun, and an anti-aircraft gun. Importantly, she could accommodate between 44 and 60 men at any one time. Also of note, the Type 7 in its various iterations was the most produced class of submarines in naval warfare history. U-31 had a different trajectory from the very start of the Second World War. Instead of being part of the massive fleet of U-boats sent into the Atlantic Ocean, U-31 was initially sent instead into the Baltic Sea to be a part of the attack of the first country that Germany invaded, Poland. The Polish Navy was quickly overwhelmed, and so U-31 was back in port on September 2, 1939, just one day after Germany invaded Poland and World War II broke. U-31 finally entered the Battle of the Atlantic when it left the port of Wilhelmshaven with Captain Johannes Habekost at the helm on September 9, 1939, a mere 8 days into the Second World War. The U-boat crossed the English Channel on course for the western approaches, the stretch of the Atlantic southwest of Ireland. Its mission was to attack British convoys in the area. It quickly located a British convoy and successfully sank the merchant ship Aviemore. This marked U-31 as the first submarine to hunt down and successfully attack a British convoy in World War II. During that same second patrol, Habekost was also able to sink the British ship Hazeltide. U-31's third patrol was a lot shorter, with the sub out at sea for just 10 days. However, it was a highly successful patrol. Its mission had been to lay a minefield in the Bay of Loch Ewe in the Scottish North Highlands. Habekost and his crew clearly did a stellar job, since German intelligence was able to later establish that HMS Nelson had been severely damaged by landmines in Loch Ewe. HMS Nelson was the flagship of the British Home Fleet, and being hit like that in the middle of Scotland was a huge blow to British naval pride. Those same mines had also sunk 2 British auxiliary minesweepers in the loch. U-31's fourth patrol lasted 3 weeks and was another success for Habekost and his crew. The German sub was able to successfully sink 6 ships in just 6 days in December 1939 while operating in the North Sea, sinking a total tonnage of 9,256 gross tons. Ships from Norway, Denmark, Estonia, and Sweden were among those that sank. HMS Nelson was busy being badly damaged in Loch Ewe during those heady December days. U-31 returned, somewhat triumphantly no doubt, to port at Wilhelmshaven on December 11, 1939. U-31's fortunes seemed to take a nosedive after those first 4 highly productive patrols. Its next patrol was to once again lay mines in Loch Ewe, but none of them ever hit any targets. And an attempt at a torpedo attack on January 28, 1940 proved unsuccessful. 3 days later, the crew realized that the fresh water on board couldn't be drunk, and so U-31 was forced to return to Wilhelmshaven. It was like an omen of what was to later befall the submarine. U-31 spent a month at the shipyard undertaking repairs. Finally, she was ready again, and so Habekost and his crew took U-31 out on March 11th to Jadabusen Bay for a test dive. It was at around noon that a British Blenheim from the 82nd Squadron of the Royal Air Force appeared directly overhead. Its engines switched off and dropped 2 bombs directly onto the U-boat. U-31 immediately sank, making it the first German submarine to be sunk by overhead aircraft attack. German rescue ships were sent to where U-31 had sunk, but to no avail. Not only had Habekost and his entire crew died, but so too 13 workers and engineers from the shipyard who had been invited to participate in the test dive. A total of 58 men died on U-31 that day. It took 17 days to raise U-31 before she could be delivered on March 28, 1940, to the Western shipyard in Wilhelmshaven to be overhauled. Her repairs took 4 months, enabling U-31 to re-enter service for the Kriegsmarine on July 30th with a new commander on board, Lieutenant Commander Wilhelm Prellberg. She undertook a 10-day inspection, which she passed, thereafter entering the Baltic Sea for her 6th patrol as U-31. She made out for Norway accompanied by escort ships, and parted with the escort 2 days later at Kristiansand in Norway. U-31 was headed for the Shetland Islands to the north of Scotland. It was there that Prellberg received notice on September 26 that a northward-bound convoy had been spotted off Western Ireland. U-31 made a dash for the supposed location of the convoy, only to be later informed by U-boat headquarters that the coordinates had been wrong. Prellberg and his crew were angry at this, given that it could have exposed U-31 to unnecessary overhead or ship attack while forging ahead at surface. He expressed his opinion in the U-31 war log with this clearly irate entry. Took up a position on the convoy's route. Complete nonsense. The convoy reported by U-29 ended up in square 9813, too far to the south. There are no signals. I returned to my position. Fortunately for Prellberg, the very next day, U-31 was able to attack and successfully sink a Norwegian vessel, Vestvard. It was an armed vessel that had been part of convoy OB-218 out of England. Unfortunately for the Norwegian ship, it had fallen behind its convoy, which is why it was so vulnerable to attack by U-31. It was during that 6th patrol that U-31 gained its notoriety as being possibly the most torpedoed U-boat in history. Prellberg's submarine would sail on October 8, 1940, into what became known as its Battle of Biscay in the Bay of Biscay off the west coast of France. Upon approach to the German-occupied port of Lorient early that morning, U-31 suddenly came under attack by the British submarine, HMS Trident. Lieutenant Commander Geoffrey Mainwaring Sladen was at the helm of the British sub, and he was intent on hunting U-boats in the Bay of Biscay. Signalmen aboard HMS Trident spotted a German submarine on the port side at 6:30 that morning. It was U-31. Sladen ordered full speed ahead and immediately fired a salvo of 5 torpedoes at the German target, of which one did not deploy. None of the first 4 successfully deployed British torpedoes hit their target, however. Now almost at point-blank range, HMS Trident fired a further 2 torpedoes at U-31, with a 7th deployed 2 minutes later. That last torpedo was the one that had initially failed to deploy. Amazingly, U-31 was able to actively maneuver around and dodge all of these British torpedoes, which is why the acoustician on board HMS Trident could hear none of the telltale booms of torpedoes hitting the hull of the U-boat. However, the British submarine's sonar did pick up a signal at 9 o'clock, which the British crew mistook as being the hull of U-31. They were wrong, but left the battlefield nevertheless convinced they had downed a German U-boat. The Germans on board U-31 knew that they somehow dodged not 1, but at least 7 torpedoes. Prellberg must have felt vindicated as a submarine commander. His rather sarcastic last entry before reaching port does suggest that, in which he wrote, "On this voyage the boat played the role of a target ship for British submarines, was attacked 3 times and received a total of 7 eels." It would later transpire that in fact no less 11 torpedoes had been fired at U-31, possibly even 12. It's quite probable that not a single German U-boat was ever subject to so much torpedo fire without being sunk. But it would seem that U-31's luck would finally run out after that momentous and crazy 6th patrol. It may have survived its Battle of Biscay, but U-31 seemed destined to not make it to the end of the war. U-31 set out for its 7th and final patrol on October 19, 1940. It was an uneventful campaign for the first 10 days, That changed on October 29th, when U-31 sank the British ship Matina. Although it had already been previously damaged by U-29, it would be U-31's last successful sinking. The fate of U-31 would be sealed by the British destroyer HMS Antelope. The destroyer was part of Allied escort convoy OB-237 when it encountered U-31 off northwestern Ireland on October 31st. HMS Antelope launched a series of depth charges at U-31, which drove the German submarine to the surface. Prellberg and his crew abandoned their U-boat. The British destroyer picked up 44 of U-31's crew, of whom one would later die on board. 2 days later, on November 2nd, HMS Antelope collided with U-31 during efforts made to board the unmanned submarine. The collision sank U-31, destroying the U-boat once and for all. The British ship sustained damage from the collision, and so, it limped back to its base in the Clyde in Scotland, with the crew of U-31 now prisoners on board. And just like that, U-31, which had once seemed almost invincible, would become known as the only U-boat in the Battle of the Atlantic that was sunk not once but twice. In its 7 patrols, U-31 was able to sink 11 merchant ships at a total of 27,751 gross registered tons, as well as 2 auxiliary warships, not to mention the extensive damage to HMS Nelson caused by mines it had laid down. It had accomplished all that in just over a year, between September 1939 and October 1940. For such a short-lived career, it was an impressive tally. 785. That was the total number of German U-boats that were destroyed during World War II. It was a very significant hit rate given that 1,162 U-boats were built during the war. The 377 U-boats that remained at the end of the war were either surrendered to the Allies or scuttled by the Germans themselves. Like every other submarine in history, each of those U-boats told a story. They are the stories of patrols, attacks, retreats, and all the men who were crew on board all those vessels, and all too often died on them. After all, 75% of men who were crew on U-boats lost their lives. Each U-boat was unique in what it achieved or failed to achieve, but few had a history as unique as that of U-31, the U-boat that sank twice.